Hi, welcome to our emissions rate lab presentation. This is brought to you by SAJA. I'm Julia.
I'm Ashley.
I'm Sophia.
And I'm Anya.
This February, we learned that it's not just love in the air, but also pollutants. For example, carbon dioxide, particulate matter, and VOCs. And high concentrations of these pollutants can cause various diseases and an increase in greenhouse gases. So in order to better understand what influences the emission rates of these pollutants and how to reduce harmful emissions, we in our lab studied what changes these different rates.
A little overview of exactly the experiments that we ran. The first one we ran was a CO2 emission rate experiment with dry ice. Each group had different versions of this experiment. Our version specifically was a fan with the CO2 sensor at the bottom of the covered top. So you place a CO2 monitor on the bottom surface of the fume hood with the fan. You put the small piece of dry ice to mimic the CO2 and poke a hole to allow emissions. You record the CO2 measurements every minute for 6 minutes. The next one was a VOC and HCHO emission rate experiment. We used a beaker with a disinfectant that releases VOCs, and we put it in a closed container on top of a hot plate. So as the temperature rose, we recorded these values for approximately every 30 seconds for 10 minutes. The last experiment that we ran was a particulate matter experiment, specifically PM 2.5 and PM 10. We lit a candle and recorded the initial values and the PM values from the candle for every 30 seconds for 10 minutes, and then we blew out the candle and recorded these values every 30 seconds for just 1 minute.
For our first experiment, our group did the CO2 emissions with a low place sensor and a fan. Here we have the table showing our ppmv values of the CO2 that we recorded. You can see that as the time increases, so does that, further explained by the graph. Next group did a low place sensor without a fan. And so you can see that their ppmv emission or concentration of their emissions rose rather quickly, and then it kind of maxed out the measuring tool. And so we can see at 180 seconds where it gets to 10,000, it most likely was over that, but the sensor read error. And lastly for that, there was the high place sensor without a fan. You can see a little bit lower emissions here, as carbon dioxide is much heavier than the oxygen, so it will fall. So as the time rises, we can still see that kind of increase, but it has like a lower slope than that of the other ones. Finally, here we kind of have all three of the experiments and their graphs shown at the same time, with the orange being the low sensor and mixed, while the gray is low sensor and unmixed. The gray is going to be low and mixed, while the blue is high sensor and unmixed. So you can kind of see how that high sensor recorded a lower value of that concentration, while the low sensor recorded a very high one. Next was the VOC emissions. With this, as the disinfectant was being heated up and releasing, we can see that the VOCs stayed somewhat stable, and then they jumped up. So you can see on our graph as that it stayed pretty flat and then skyrocketed super quick and then flattened off once again. Our last experiment was the particulate matter emissions. As the candle was burning, you can see the particulate matter of 10 and 2.5. It grew slightly, but mostly stayed around the same values. But at 600 seconds, once we blew out the candle, it skyrocketed, as you can see at 6:30, where the PM 2.5 was like 885. So it really jumped and then fell back down.
So as Julia just mentioned, the condition where the sensor is placed high had a very low emission rate because of the density of CO2. And as mentioned in the lab handout, and a possible error with the first step of this data analysis could have been because we used the ideal gas equation. And as we know, CO2 is not an ideal gas. So, yes.
So with every experiment, it's important to address the potential errors that we could have made. So with the CO2 emissions errors, the first thing that we want to note is the wrong placement of the fan can disturb air circulation. When we began, the fan was directed at such an angle that we kind of like lowered the concentration of the CO2, and we could have potentially gotten the wrong values because of the circulation that we caused with the angle placement. Since CO2 is heavier than surrounding air, it tends to sink. That's why it's important that the fan keeps the air circulating but isn't blasting in the face of whatever we're calculating, because then it would reduce the concentration. Additionally, pulling down the fume hood is really important because you want to make sure that whatever you're measuring has closed circulation rather than open, because then you could also, again, like lose the concentration of said gas. And additionally, it's important to stay consistent with our data taking. We tried to make sure that we were taking it at consistent intervals, because having like a 5 or 10 second difference will change slope, and it would change whatever pattern that we're recognizing. Additionally, with the data analysis of the VOC and HCHOs, like Julia talked about, the trend between the mass and time of VOCs and HCHO, as time increased, we saw that the concentration of said particles also increased. So there's a positive relationship, and the huge potential HCHO health risks and speed of contamination do align with industrial efforts to minimize formaldehyde exposure, as our experiment proved.
And then with the particulate matter experiment, we had a very low emission rate. And this did not increase until that last time interval, where we blew out the candle and there was a very large increase in particulate matter.
Additionally, the errors for VOC and PM emissions are also important to note. Again, with inconsistent data taking, because since time is usually the x-axis for all the graphs that we made, it's important that we were taking at consistent time intervals. Additionally, contamination of samples or regions with other chemicals or dust or residues from previous experiments could be a reason why the concentration of whatever gas we were measuring could have been lower, or it could have been like altered in some way. Additionally, sealing the samples and evaporation loss is something we have to take note of, because VOCs can evaporate from samples during storage or during our analysis, which would lead to, again, underestimation of the concentrations. And to finally, just to note, the fan also could have been too strong or angled incorrectly in the face of the gases.
All right, and finally, some data interpretation summarizations that we came to was that we noticed when there was a fan, the concentration of CO2 was lowered, and the CO2 concentration tended to be higher at lower elevations. This is most likely due to its weight, and the gas tends to sink instead of rise. For the candle experiment, we found that the PM levels recorded stayed relatively constant until the candle was blown out. VOC and HCO emission rates gradually increased as the temperature increased, which makes sense, and it leveled out at a certain temperature which was probably its max temperature. Some experimental error we found was we had to repeat our first experiment, but that was only due to a dry ice system being messed up. But the data we presented today was our new value. And occasionally measurements would change, but that was for measuring points. The data would change before the measuring point, so we thought that was worth mentioning. And sometimes values on measurement devices were not always stable. How can we relate this to environmental engineering? Well, CO2 emissions are a large part of environmental engineering. We can relate this to schools, cars, classrooms, basically anywhere in general that has lots of emissions. Engineers can work to create better ventilation systems or indication systems that help us indicate emission rates and concentrations, because these can affect our attentiveness and energy levels in lots of areas. So thank you for listening to our presentation. Bye.
Thanks.